Hello and welcome back to another episode of Marksman Radio. Today I'm going to be talking about the Biden plan to end our gun violence epidemic. Anyway, if that all sounds interesting to you, please stick around. That's coming up now. All right, everybody. In this video, what I'm going to be doing is going through the entire Biden plan on gun control, and I'm going to go through every single thing point by point, so this is probably going to be a pretty long form video. I will have down pinned to the top of the comment section a timestamp for each topic, so if you want to skip ahead to different topics, hear what sort of first I'm going to summarize what they're actually looking to do, what implications I think this will have on the gun industry, and then my take on each one of those proposed plans. So I think that this will be important for especially new gun owners, people who might not know a lot about the firearms industry or the laws that regulate the firearm industry. This might be good information for you. Anyway, let's go ahead and dive into it now. So the synopsis of basically the overarching idea of the plan, we start off with the Biden plan to end our gun violence epidemic. And there will be a link down in the description to the actual plan so you can follow along at home. It starts. Joe Biden knows that gun violence is a public health epidemic. Almost 40,000 people die as a result of firearm injuries every year in the United States, and many more people are wounded. Some of these deaths are injuries as a result of mass shootings that make up national headlines. Others are a result of daily acts of gun violence and suicides that may not make national headlines but are just as devastating to the families and communities left behind. Joe Biden has taken on the National Rifle Association, NRA, on the national stage and won twice. In 1993, he shepherded through Congress the Brady Handgun Violence Protection Act, which established a background check system that has since kept more than 3 million firearms out of dangerous hands. In 1994, Biden, along with Senator Dianne Feinstein, secured the passage of a 10-year ban on assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. As President, Joe Biden will defeat the NRA again. Joe Biden also knows how to make progress on reducing gun violence using executive action. After the tragedy at Sandy Hook Elementary School in 2012, President Obama tasked Vice President Biden with developing both legislative proposals and executive actions to make our communities safer. As a result of these efforts, the Obama-Biden administration took more than 24 actions, including narrowing the so-called gun show loophole, increasing the number of records in the background check system, and expanding funding for mental health services. It is within our grasp to end our gun violence epidemic and respect the Second Amendment, which is limited, as President Biden will pursue constitutional common sense gun safety policies. Biden will, and then we get into these. So first, the synopsis. We talk about a couple things. The first is the NRA. It's actually kind of funny, in my opinion. The NRA is often heralded as the figurehead or the main spokespiece for the gun-owning community. The NRA, the American gun-owning public is about 150 million people. The NRA has about 5 million members. So if you do the math, the owner or the subscribership or the population that makes up the NRA is actually a very small percentage of the gun-owning community. They're often touted as, this is the face of gun ownership in America. People who are anti-gun like to do that. Right now, it's kind of interesting because there is not a whole lot of support for the NRA within the gun community. You have all the issues with the leadership of the NRA taking finances and donations to do their own personal vacations, buying personal assets, giving a very lucrative contract to board members and their families who own other businesses. So they're in a lot of hot water with the gun-owning community anyway. The GOA, Gun Owners of America, is actually more of a leader, in my opinion, on the legislative side of pushing through gun ownership. So I think the NRA is an easy target. Again, I really don't see as much support for the NRA on the gun community side as I see for other organizations that, in my opinion, do a better job of pushing our rights forward. So, of course, people who are anti-gun or not in the gun community suspect or often attribute the NRA as being the spokesperson of gun people, so they're often the target. But I just wanted to clear that up. Talking about action that was taken during the Obama presidency, there wasn't, in my opinion, being in the gun industry, anything that really ever happened. And in my opinion, that's good. So they're saying they took all these actions to close the gun show loophole. They had 24 actions. I really don't know what those are. It would be nice if he actually laid out exactly what those things were and the effects that they had, but that's kind of the issue with proposed gun control is we don't often see verifiable evidence on the positive effects of a lot of these things that have happened. He ends it with, it is within our grasp to end the gun violence epidemic. So, of course, you can definitely see the characterization of gun ownership, and the number that was given, 40,000 deaths, I think is a little high. I think most stats put it at about 30 to 32,000, but that's pretty trivial. We do know that of that number, and to their credit, they did put suicides listed, were listed as a cause of death. But typically suicides make up a vast majority of those numbers. If you actually go to firearm-related homicide, it's about 12,000. If you back out gang-related violence and homicide, you're down to about 4,000. So there are about, unless you're in a gang, your chances of being killed by a firearm in this country are about 400,000 over 350 million. So it's astronomically low. I think your chances of getting hit by lightning are higher. And statistically, you are more likely to be shot by somebody you know, not in an active shooter or random act of violence sort of scenario. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead to the first point: hold gun manufacturers accountable. So it states that in 2005, then Senator Biden voted against the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act, but gun manufacturers successfully lobbied Congress to secure the passage. This law protects these manufacturers from being held civilly liable for their products, a protection granted to no other industry. Biden will prioritize repealing this protection. So there is a lot of misconception in this point. This was something that Senator Bernie Sanders was raked over the coals over because he actually voted in favor of this act, and I think it actually makes a whole lot of sense. First of all, they're saying that the firearm industry is the only one who enjoys this type of legislation. That's very, very misleading. What we basically have here is, I'm not an attorney, and I always try and make that very clear, but I do have a degree in business, and to get my business degree, I did have to take business law courses, and I did take a liabilities course. And to me, this falls purely under product liabilities. Sorry, my dog just came. It's funny, they're asleep all day, and then I turn on the camera and they start walking around and come over. Oh, here comes the other one. So anyway, I'll press on. Gun manufacturers, okay, let's get into this from the perspective of another industry. So let's look at the car industry. So there was an interesting case in, I believe it was the 1970s, and it involved the Ford Pinto. Many of you guys might remember this case, but the Ford Pinto had a gas tank that was positioned underneath the rear bumper of the vehicle. What typically would happen is if a car was involved in a rear-end collision, it would lead to usually an explosion or a fire that would increase the likelihood of death or serious damage to the driver in cases that may have not otherwise occurred, like a low-speed fender bender from the rear, what may have resulted in a minor case of whiplash, but now you have an entire family burned alive. And that was the sort of thing that was happening. Ford was made aware of these problems, yet they actually, it was interesting, they did an assessment of if we did a recall and complete redesign of the Ford Pinto, it would actually cost more per unit than to pay people in lawsuits resulting in damages from this issue. And Ford actually did that assessment, and as a result, they found it would be more expensive to do a recall. And they were, I mean, once that was made public, they were hugely hurt as a company in terms of their reputation, which is to be expected. In this case, Ford was sued for the Pinto, and Ford did have to pay damages. You have a product made by Ford, which is a vehicle. The vehicle needs to be relatively safe. It needs to meet road safety standards, and it needs to get people from point A to point B. When you push on the gas, it needs to go. When you push on the brake, it needs to stop. When you turn the wheel, it needs to go in the direction that the driver wants it to go. As long as those things occur, the company really can't be held liable for the misuse or dangerous use or negligent use or harmful use of their product, where a person acts upon that product in a way that the product was not intended to be made or used, and uses the product to break laws. Let's say somebody gets in a drunk driving accident, or somebody intentionally drives the car through a crowd of people. The car manufacturer cannot be held liable under product liability laws for that reason, but Ford could be held liable for the Ford Pinto because the product was defective and not working the way it should. In the United States, we have the constitutional right, and we have agreed that it is acceptable for manufacturing companies to design and make firearms to fire a bullet at high velocity towards a target. And as long as those products are used in accordance with state, federal laws, that is what those products are designed to do. If somebody takes that product and uses the product for what it's designed to do, but uses it to break the law and kill somebody, this law would state you cannot sue the gun manufacturer for doing that. And that is the same in really any other industry. I guess technically you could sue, but you're not going to win. And we saw that as a case with the Sandy Hook parents who were suing Remington, and I'll come back to that. However, the firearm has to be reasonably safe and work the way it's explained or advertised to work. And if it doesn't, then you do fall under product liability law and you can be sued. Perfect example of that is Remington with the Remington 700. You guys might remember several years ago there was a defect in the trigger. Sometimes when you put the firearm on safe, it would discharge the firearm. Remington knew of this problem but didn't really take appropriate steps to fix it, and it did result in, I think, 2 or 3 cases of death or severe injury as a result of the firearm going off when the owner of the firearm was not intending for it to, simply by putting the firearm on safe. Remington was sued for that in a class action and they lost. So you can sue firearm manufacturers for negligence in putting out a defective and dangerous, harmful product that will not work the way it's intended to work. You cannot sue them simply because somebody takes the firearm and uses it for illegal purposes when the firearm is not malfunctioning and it is firing the way it's intended to fire. If that were to be something that a firearm manufacturer can be sued for, then the country just needs to say, listen, manufacturers cannot create guns. But since you can create guns, you can build a company, you can sell firearms, you should not be held liable for the misuse of somebody using the firearm illegally when the firearm is otherwise working as it's intended to work. That's just that for me. So that has always irritated me. I think it's a huge misconception. It's like the firearm industry has some sort of special privileges that no other industry has. I guess, I totally disagree with that. Anyway, moving on. Get weapons of war off our streets. Well, that's a loaded statement. Weapons of war off of our streets. We don't have weapons of war on our streets, or maybe we do, but they're not owned by law-abiding citizens. Let's just go on to say what it says. The bans on assault weapons and high-capacity magazines that Biden, along with Senator Feinstein, secured in 1994, which was the assault weapons ban of 1994, the Clinton crime bill, reduced the lethality of mass shootings. But in order to secure the passage of the bans, they had to agree to a 10-year sunset provision, and when the time came, the Bush administration failed to extend them, as President Biden will. And then he goes on to a couple points about this, but let's talk about that. Assault weapons. Okay. This has been harped on over and over and over again. An assault weapon is a select fire, intermediate cartridge, shoulder fired rifle. Yes, assault weapons are weapons of war. Those are M16s, AK-47s, trying to think, FAMASs, anything that sort of fits that category. Those can be purchased by private citizens. However, those are controlled by the NFA. You do have to pay a lot of money and go through a lot of hoops to get those, and Biden explains that later. What we have is not assault weapons. They are modern sporting rifles that have the appearance of a AR-15 or such. High-capacity magazines, we need to define what high capacity means. Standard capacity for an AR platform or an AKM platform are 30 rounds. High capacity is, I guess, anything over 30, or does high capacity mean standard capacity? Is high capacity anything over 10? A 10-round magazine for a 1911 would be considered a 1911 high capacity 1911 magazine because standard capacity is 7. So that's the problem when you get into semantics. Also with assault weapons, how do we define that? Is it anything that fires semi-automatically with a pistol grip? Does that mean Mini 14s? Does that mean 1022s? That's the huge issue we run into here. It sounds good, but when you really get into the weeds of what this means, it really quickly falls apart, and you realize that lots and lots and lots of things are banned. Now, you could just say, if it is an AR-15 or an AKM, it's banned, everything else is fine. That would be more specific. I wouldn't agree with it, but let's just move on from there. Ban the manufacture and sale of assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. Federal law prevents hunters from hunting migratory game birds with more than 3 shells in their shotgun. The reason for that is not for the protection of the animal, that is for the protection of other people. That is so if an overzealous, untrained hunter sees a goose flying in the air, they're not just emptying a magazine into it, firing all over the place. That's just to protect from, you know, falling rounds on people that might be a mile off in the distance, things like that. Other hunting things need to be taken, but Biden has always said that, you know, this is for the protection of geese, and we do more to protect our geese. You're not protecting geese, you're protecting people. So that is a rule that is in place to protect people. That means our federal laws do more to protect ducks and children. There it is. It's wrong that Joe Biden will enact legislation to once again. It says it's wrong, I'm sorry. Joe Biden will enact legislation to once again ban assault weapons. This time the bans will be designed based on lessons learned from the 1994 bans. For example, the ban on assault weapons will be designed to prevent manufacturers from circumventing the law by making minor changes that don't limit the weapon's lethality. While working to pass this legislation, Biden will also use his extensive authority to ban the importation of assault weapons. He's talking about things like thumbhole stocks, barrels that did not have threaded muzzles, and this is stuff that we saw during the crime ban, the 1994 to 2004 ban. You saw a lot of products coming out that did not have these features, or featureless firearms. So you were still creating AR-15s, they just didn't have pistol grips, they did not have bayonet locks, they did not have threaded barrels. If we're saying we're also going to ban workarounds, what does that mean? Does that mean that firearms without threaded muzzles are going to be banned also? Does that mean things without pistol grips? So there's a lot of talk, and it's all fluff, and when you really get down to it, it doesn't make a lot of sense, and a lot of this stuff is really impossible to define. You would have to just have a legitimate list of banning things by model and name. The thing that will happen is manufacturers will just make new names and models. So this is just the boogeyman that can never be caught, but it makes for great reading on a presidential candidate's, hoorah statement, and I don't think a lot of this is really going to go anywhere, but I'll press on. Regulate the possession of existing assault weapons under the National Firearms Act. This is interesting. He's basically saying that we're going to ban the future manufacture of ARs and AKs and importation of those, but the ones you have can be registered with the NFA. That is the National Firearms Act registry, and that is the way that suppressors, SBRs, SBSs, and machine guns are currently registered and controlled. Yes, it is true that those items are rarely used in the commission of crimes. In fact, since 1936, I think one machine gun, and that was by a FBI agent, and it was a MAC-10, was used in the commission of a crime. If we do this, the pricing of AR-15s and such will explode like they did with machine guns. People will register them, and 30 years from now, a standard semi-automatic AR-15 will be worth $20,000 or $30,000, adjusting for inflation. You will, keep in mind, have to pay a $200 tax. I'm afraid that they may raise that because that has not been raised since 1936. What you're doing is you're pricing low-income people out of the firearms market, which to me is income inequality, which is a very anti-democratic stance. That also is going to mean that if you want an AR-15 or something like that, you're going to have to wait a long time. Now, there are 390 million firearms in this country. Of those, I don't know how many are ARs or AKs, but there will very quickly become a market for people on the streets to buy them. So any sort of conduct or misconduct with the use of those firearms will likely continue in illegal purposes, illegal. So legal owners, of course, will be the ones affected by this. That goes without saying. But let's go ahead. It says currently the National Firearms Act requires individuals possessing machine gun silencers, short barrel rifles to undergo background checks and register those weapons with the BATF. Due to these requirements, such weapons rarely are used in crime, which is correct, as President Biden will pursue legislation to regulate possession of the existing weapons. There were also only about 300,000 machine guns on the registry. Okay, that pales in comparison to the amount of ARs and AKs. So I would also argue that machine guns and such are not choice weapons for creating a lot of indiscriminate carnage, if you will. When you use a machine gun, it's more to whom it may concern, and an AR-15 or something that's semi-automatic is more of a direct use application. So again, if it came down to it, I would rather ARs and such be registered with the NFA rather than be banned wholesale. But I still think it's all useless, and I mean, just like I think the NFA in its entirety is useless. But anyway, let's continue. buy back the assault weapons and high capacity magazines already in communities. So if you don't want to register, you can sell them back. It'll probably be for pennies on the dollar. We've heard of the buyback programs. Buyback is a misnomer. They didn't buy them, or you did not buy them from Joe Biden in the first place. So it's basically a forced relinquishing of the products. Because we have a constitution, you cannot, or you have to be compensated for those products, so they have to pay you something. What percentage of the value is, I don't know. Do they have to give you the 100% of the market value, 25%? I don't know if there's such a law. Reducing stockpiling of weapons. So that means so in order to reduce the stockpiling of firearms, Biden supports legislation restricting the number of firearms an individual may purchase per month to only one. This is going to be hugely devastating to gun store owners like myself and people in the manufacturing side of things. Very, very few people own a lot of the firearms. I think the average gun owner owns something like 4 or 5 guns. Many people own 50, 60, many people own 10, many people own 15. A lot of people who have guns very seldomly just have one. Okay, there's usually a reason, like you have your hunting firearm, your home defense firearm, your sporting firearm, and then some people like to collect things like World War II collectibles like I do. There is nothing wrong with wanting to collect firearms versus cars, versus coins, versus stamps. It's something that people enjoy collecting. The stockpiling thing makes absolutely no sense to me. In fact, if you have a legal person who can own firearms, I would think it's better that those people control more of them. They're less likely to end up in the hands of criminals and things like that. You only have 2 hands. If you have 50 firearms and you wanted to do something stupid with them, you could only use 2 maximum to do that. The rest of them become useless. So it's just, again, it's just nonsense, but let's keep moving. Okay, next, keep guns out of dangerous hands. The federal background check system, the NICS background check system, is one of the best tools we have to prevent gun violence, but it's only effective when it's used. Biden will enact universal background check legislation and close other loopholes that allow people who should be prohibited from purchasing firearms from making those purchases specifically. He will. Let's unpack that first. This is the one thing I think probably has the highest chance of actually passing. Currently, if you go into a gun store, you have to complete a NICS, National Instant Criminal Background Check. And once that is completed, you can take possession of the firearm. However, if you want to purchase a firearm from a friend, a neighbor, a spouse, whatever, somebody on arms list, you can do that as well, and you do not have to conduct a background check. Now, that varies state by state. Here in Indiana, you do not. In most states, you do not. What they want to do is they basically want to make it universal. They want, if you have to do a background check inside a store, then you also have to do one in a private transaction. There are some exemptions here listed for that, like letting a friend borrow something or gifting something to a family member. But that is the essential guideline. So moving on, it says require background checks for all gun sales. I just went over that. It says today an estimated 1 in 5 firearms are sold or transferred without a background check. Biden will enact universal background check legislation requiring a background check for all gun sales, with very limited exceptions such as gifts between close family members. This will close the so-called gun show loopholes that the Obama-Biden administration narrowed. I don't know what they did to narrow that, but which cannot be fully closed without executive action. Or by executive action alone, I'm sorry. I don't know what they did to close the gun show loophole. What they're talking about is they're saying at a gun show, if you buy from a private vendor, yes, you can purchase a firearm without doing a background check. However, if you're buying that firearm from a gun dealer at the gun show, you do have to conduct a background check. So what they call the gun show loophole basically means private sale transactions. Okay, moving on, he says close other loopholes in the federal background check system in addition to closing the boyfriend loophole. I don't know what that is. That's a new term to me. Highlighted below, Biden will reinstate the Obama-Biden policy to keep guns out of the hands of certain people unable to manage their affairs for mental reasons, which President Trump reversed. It goes on to say, in 2016, the Obama-Biden administration finalized a rule to make sure the Social Security Administration, SSA, sends to the background check system records that it holds of individuals who are prohibited from purchasing or possessing firearms because they have been adjudicated by the SSA as unable to manage their affairs for mental reasons. But one of the first actions Donald Trump took as president was to reverse this rule. President Biden will enact legislation to codify this policy. Okay, so I remember when this happened, and it was there was a lot of debate over this when President Donald Trump reversed this decision. To real quick, let's summarize what the act actually says in its own summary very quickly, it states these final rules implement provisions of the NICS Improvement Amendment of 2007 that require federal agencies to provide relevant records to the Attorney General for inclusion in the NICS system. Under these final rules, we will identify on a prospective basis individuals who receive disability insurance benefits under Title II of the Social Security Act or Supplemental Security Income SSI payments under the Title 16 of the Act who also meet certain other criteria, including an award of benefits based on the finding that the individual's mental impairments meets or medically equals the requirements of Section 12 of the listing of impairments and receipt of benefits through a representative payee. The problem with this is it leads into the same issue that you get with the restricted people on flight lists. It's like saying, okay, people who are on the restricted flyer list should not be able to own firearms. The problem is when you make these vast group inclusions, there could be people who are placed under these definitions or placed into these categories who perfectly have the mental facility to be able to enjoy their Second Amendment rights. And because somebody needs to be on government assistance for Social Security or benefits due to a physical or mental impairment, does that necessarily disqualify them from owning a firearm? The thing is in our legal system, if somebody does actually have schizophrenia, paranoia, things that we probably as a society would agree that are not the best things for people with those conditions to have firearms, you basically say not all of, or you could say all of those people could be on medical assistance, but not all people on medical assistance are schizophrenic paranoids. You can go through other methods of getting an adjudicated mental defective judgment against those people if you so choose, if you believe that those people are actually dangerous. But when you cast a very large net, you catch a lot of people who end up being perfectly capable of owning and using a firearm, but just because they need government assistance for their financial affairs, does that necessarily disqualify them? I'm sure we're going to get into the flight, the prohibited flyer issue, and that is the same thing. It's a very people could be restricted from flying for many different reasons. And of course, you could say somebody like Lauren Southern is going to be on the no-fly list because she talked about some sort of controversial issue. And then now, because you have that way of saying, okay, these people are banned wholesale from being able to possess firearms, if you can just get them on the list somehow for any reason, that is how you backdoor away their Second Amendment rights. So that's why it gets a little bit hairy, and that's why people have issues with the fact that when you create subgroups of people who are just banned outright from a constitutional right, you're going to do a little bit of murky water there. Okay, I think it needs to be a little bit more on a case-by-case basis for the person and for the exact reasons that they have laws that they have broken or things that have happened to make them lose their rights, rather than this sort of minority report attack, which is what essentially these sorts of perspectives or these approaches become, in my opinion. Close the hate crime loophole. Biden will enact legislation prohibiting an individual who has been convicted of a misdemeanor hate crime or received or enhanced sentence for a misdemeanor because of hate bias on its commission from purchasing or possessing a firearm. Again, you're attributing motive. If you can say, okay, here's this person that we don't want to have a firearm and they robbed a Hispanic woman, we can say the robbery was a hate crime. Maybe it was a misdemeanor petty theft. I don't really know, again, what those charges are, but you can say you're blanketing that into like the domestic violence misdemeanor thing. Whether people are for or against this, I don't know, but again, it just opens up prosecutory options for people to pursue in order to quell the rights of other people, sort of like red flag laws, if you will. So there's that one for you. Closing the Charleston loophole. What this is talking about is it says here, the Charleston loophole allows people to complete a firearms purchase if their background check is not completed within 3 business days. Biden supports the proposal in the enhanced background checks of 2019, which extends the timeline from 3 days to 10 days. Biden will also direct the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, to put on his desk within the first 100 days as president a report detailing the cases in which background checks are not completed within 10 business days and steps the federal government can take to reduce or eliminate the occurrence. This is really funny. So the Charleston loophole, this was, I'm not going to name the person, but was a shooter in Charleston who used a firearm to shoot I believe it was 8 or 9 African-American people in a place of worship, their church, which of course is horrible and atrocious, and we all agree with that. Now, he had pending drug charges, and had it been that the background check would have taken longer to clear, the argument was that they would have had the time to find it, he would have been denied and not gotten the firearm. Currently, as it stands right now on the 4473 that you complete, if your status is not returned within a period of 3 days, then the dealer at their discretion can legally transfer possession of that firearm to you. What they want to do is increase that from 3 days to 10. I think that's incredibly arbitrary. What's going to happen is there's not going to be any additional funding paid or given to the NICS personnel to conduct these background checks any faster. So what's going to happen is delays are just going to go from 3 days to 10. This whole putting it on President Biden's desk, do you really see him sitting there sifting through thousands and thousands of 4473s that are past the 10-day delay? That's absolutely not what's going to happen. He might assign it to a committee, which will do nothing with it. It's just, all it's going to do is lengthen the amount of time that law-abiding people are prohibited from owning a firearm. If they are not able to complete the background check in the stated period of time, they need to let the person enjoy their constitutional rights. If we start going down this rabbit hole, it's like the NFA. When are we going to get to the point where they remove this requirement at all and it's no time period? Then they can just sit on your background check for months at a time. Now, I know that's a slippery slope fallacy, but when we're talking to politics, fallacies are not out of the question. So, okay, moving on. Close the fugitive from justice loophole created by the Trump administration. So, because of actions by the Trump administration, records of almost 500,000 fugitives from justice who are prohibited from purchasing firearms were deleted from the background check system. The Biden administration will restore these records and enact legislation to make clear that people facing arrest warrants are prohibited from purchasing and possessing firearms. Okay, this is a huge misrepresentation. When President Obama was in office, he directed his Department of Justice to redefine or to use a different definition of what a fugitive from justice is. And on the 4473 background check system, if you are a fugitive from justice, you cannot possess or complete the background check system or background check, and you cannot possess a firearm legally. Now, of course, when this all went into effect, President Donald Trump was in office, and of course he was railed for having let all these fugitives from justice now be wiped from the NICS system. So at the time that this news broke, the acting FBI Deputy Director Andrew Bowdick had testified before the Senate Intelligence Committee that, and this is a quote, "It was the Department of Justice Office of Legal Counsel that reviewed the law and believed that it needed to be interpreted so that if someone was a fugitive in a state, there had to be indications that they had crossed state lines." And that was the change in the interpretation of the definition of fugitive. Without that indication, the DOJ does not consider somebody a fugitive. Speaking about the record of purge, he said that that was a decision made under the previous administration. So the purge occurred in February of 2017. That was, President Trump's first full year in office, and the news of it broke in November of that year. And at the time, it appeared that Trump had made a grave error. Only through Bowdick's testimony on Wednesday did the public learn the truth. Why would the DOJ do such a thing? It all stems from a disagreement over the meaning of the term fugitive. So until February, the NICS system would flag someone as a fugitive if there was an open warrant out for that person's arrest. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosions, the ATF, defines a fugitive under the ATF rule is someone with an open warrant who has crossed state lines. So before, the interpretation of fugitive was anybody that was basically running from the law. It was under the order of President Obama, under his administration, that would have been redefined to meaning anybody who is running from the law and who has crossed state lines. Because a new definition needs to be interpreted by the ATF and applied in that manner, it then removed about 500,000 people from the background check system, those people who were on the run from the law but had not crossed state lines. That's a huge misnomer, and that should be very apparent when you actually read the wording on the Biden-Harris page, and you see that their source for this comes from the Gifford Law Center. So which is the most biased source you could possibly put out there. So anyway, I will put that one to rest with that, let you guys interpret what you will. In the online sale of firearms and ammunition. So Biden will enact legislation to prohibit all online sale of firearms, ammunition, kits, and gun parts. This would be a huge overstep in lawful commerce. So this would be the only product, firearm products, ammunition and such, that would be the only product barred from actually engaging in online e-commerce, which is arguably the way that all gun related, or I'm sorry, the way that all retail related interactions are going to be occurring, within the next 10 to 15 years. I think we're seeing the writing on the wall with a lot of mom and pop and a lot of brick and mortar retail stores of all areas and all fields going out of business. To bar the gun industry from being able to engage in that there's just absolutely no way that's going to pass. So that's just a little blip on the page anyway. Moving on. Create an effective program to ensure individuals who become prohibited from possessing firearms relinquish their weapons. It says, federal law defines categories of individuals who are prohibited from purchasing or possessing firearms, and the federal background check system is an effective tool for ensuring prohibited persons cannot purchase firearms, but we lack any serious tool to ensure that when somebody becomes newly prohibited, for example, because they commit a violent crime, they relinquish possession of their firearms. There are some promising models for how this could be enforced. For example, California has a mandatory process for ensuring relinquishment by any individual newly subject to domestic violence or restraining order. As President Biden will direct the FBI and ATF to outline a model relinquishment process and enact any necessary legislation to ensure relinquishment when individuals newly fall under one of the federal prohibitions. I understand it. Okay, somebody beats their wife, they have guns, they need to have a process to make sure that they can get their guns from them. Somebody commits a assault with a deadly weapon, they get convicted, there needs to be a process in order to make sure that those firearms are relinquished. I don't necessarily disagree with that, as long as that person has been rightfully charged and processed and convicted of a crime which would prohibit them from owning firearms. The problem is a logistical issue, and that's the problem they're having now. So basically what it needs to say is we need more funding for police agency. We need to fund the police to have the resources necessary to go and get these firearms from people who have been through the court system, who have had their day in court, and who we decided as a legal system and as a country that they cannot possess firearms. Okay, I have nothing wrong with that. Somebody breaks the law, they lose their gun rights for committing a violent crime, but all we need to do there is fund the police. So, incentivize state extreme risk laws. So extreme risk laws, also called red flag laws, enable family members or law enforcement officials to temporarily remove an individual's access to firearms when that individual is in crisis and poses a danger to themselves or others. Biden will incentivize the adoption of these laws by giving states funds to implement them, and he'll direct the U.S. Department of Justice to issue best practices and offer technical assistance to states interested in enacting the extreme risk laws. I think that these laws actually are at risk of passing in the states where they don't already exist. There are a lot of states that already have these laws on the books, Indiana included, where I am. There is a huge amount of problems with red flag laws. Okay, it's like where to begin. First of all, you are legalizing the ability for law enforcement to possess legally owned and legally purchased property from American citizens without due process, basically based strictly on the woes or the hunch or the misgivings of another third-party person. And that person's motives can be it could be a bad breakup, it could be that somebody got in an argument and they couldn't handle, voices were elevated and they got uncomfortable and they know that person have guns, and they could be doing it as revenge. It could be anything. What you're basically doing is all you have to do is tell your local law enforcement department that you are afraid for your life or somebody else's life because this person has firearms. The police department will show up at that person's house and take all of their privately owned property without due process. Then that person retroactively will have to go to court and fight to get their property back. In the meantime, that person's collection, which could be very valuable, is sitting in a police room or locker, being mishandled, being treated poorly, could be damaged, could be parts missing, could be magazines missing when you get them back. There are plenty of examples of people's personal firearms who have been retained for investigations and they get them back and they are just in awful condition. All simply, if you're giving people the power to put gun owners through that. There are plenty of cases too where there was a man where the police came to his house at like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and of course he wasn't expecting them to be there. He answered the door with a gun in his hand, and he was subsequently shot and killed by a police officer. So you're asking for a whole host of issues, and again, you are giving a backdoor option for people to confiscate people's firearms. The intent, people will say, is, if a XYZ school shooter, if we had just gotten the notice, we could have gone and taken their firearms. Well, in those cases, you do get notice and you do nothing. We saw that at the Stoneman Douglas thing. So how many times were they called? Anyway, I digress. The red flag laws are a huge mess. It's a huge infringement on people's rights. And if you're not a gun owner and you agree with red flag laws, again, I know this is going to be called the slippery slope fallacy, but when we start going down that road of people's possession being able to be taken from them without due process, there was a guy on the Mexican border who had his truck detained for like 3 years because he had a loaded handgun magazine in the glove box. He didn't have the gun, he just had the magazine. He was a concealed carry weapons holder. He took the gun out, he forgot he had a second loaded magazine. They detained his brand new, it was like a Ford F-150 that he had just bought. They detained him for like 3 hours, and he had to go through a court process for 1.5 years to get his property back. So that's the road you go down with laws like these. If you want to be a citizen in a country where your government can just take your property. Also, a couple, they were going to Vegas. They had $10,000 cash in the car, and the police officer had probable cause that it was drug-related money, although there was no drugs found in the car, and they took the couple's $10,000. Whether or not they got it back or not, I don't know, but without due process, they had their $10,000 confiscated from them. So is this really the road we want to go down as a society? I will let you decide. Okay, give states the incentive to set up gun licensing programs. Biden will enact legislation to give states and local governments grants to require individuals to obtain a license prior to a handgun purchase. The only problem I have with this, there are a couple things here that can come into play. Let's look at vehicle licensing and registration for driving a car, which, by the way, is not a constitutional right. If we put the onus on this licensing process on the DMV or any other government or state-owned facility, maybe the post office, and you don't increase funding for staffing for these organizations, what essentially can happen is the wait times can be excruciatingly long. Somebody has to have a permit just to own the firearm. Whether or not they want to carry it, they could be tied up waiting months or weeks to get their permit. Now, that will also put a huge kink in the firearm retail side of things. So I own a firearms store. If I could only sell firearms to people with these licenses and new first-time buyers, it takes them 3, 4 to 6 months to get this license, and it could end up taking that long. That's just going to put a huge strain on my business, of course, and more importantly, on the rights of that person. The other thing is money. It's obviously going to cost money to get these licenses and everything through the system. How much money is that going to cost? Is it going to be like when the NFA was instituted in the 1930s and it was a $200 tax to be able to transfer possession of an NFA item like a machine gun? At the time, $200 was like $3,000 or $4,000 today, or maybe even higher. I don't know what the inflation rate was, but it was a huge sum of money. Are they going to make handgun licenses cost $500, $1,000? They could do it if it's implemented, and if it does, again, that just prices lower income people out of being able to use their rights, which is, of course, income disparity. Adequately fund the background check system. President Obama and Vice President Biden expanded incentives for states to submit records of prohibited persons into the background check system. President Biden will continue to prioritize that funding and ensure that the FBI is adequately funded and accurately and efficiently handles the NICS system. I don't have a problem with this. In fact, as a gun store owner, if NICS is going to be a requirement, I want them to be better funded because it would hopefully reduce the risk of delay and problems in, I think we can all agree that we don't want to transfer possession of firearms to people who are actually prohibited, and that information wasn't in the system. It was like the guy in Coral Springs, Texas, who was in the Navy, who had charges there. I think it was in regarding to domestic violence. Had that information been in the system, he would have been denied. Now, would he have just gone and bought one from a smuggler or from a black market retailer or somebody who had ripped off a gun store? Clearly, he had no interest in following the law, so he could have just gone that route. But if you're going to have the background check system in place, having it well funded, to be able to be more streamlined and seamless. Also, as a gun store owner, their system goes down all the time if they put more money into keeping their system up and operational, so I don't have to not sell people guns on a weekend, which happens actually more often than you would think. I would not be opposed to that. So yes, if we're going to put if we're going to have these systems, let's make them more effective and efficient so people can get through them and get their products and their firearms more quickly and more easily too. Addressing the deadly combination of guns and domestic violence. So, the statistics tell a devastating and overwhelming story. The likelihood that a woman in a domestic violence situation will be killed increases by a factor of 5 if a gun is nearby. Half of mass shootings involve an individual shooting a family member or a former intimate partner. This deadly connection tragically impacts children, as well as 86% of children killed in shootings with 4 or more victims were involved in a domestic violence situation. Biden recognizes that gun violence and domestic violence epidemics are linked and cannot be solved in isolation. I believe that they can. Addressing the interconnectedness of these challenges will be the core focus of Biden's anti-violence work as president. So I think, of course, it is undoubtedly a good thing to address the issue of domestic violence, and of course we want to reduce those rates. This comes down to an issue of guns don't kill people, people kill people. Somebody who is a domestic abuser, if they have a propensity for violence and they want to kill somebody, of course it makes sense and stands to reason that if they have a firearm, they will likely use it to commit acts of violence because that's inherently who they are. I think addressing the issue of, I always use this argument in terms of mass shooters. It's if you ban guns, you can reduce the likelihood that a disturbed child who has an inclination to wanting to kill their classmates is going to have a less likely ability to get the gun and do it, but you have not solved the issue of why is there so many disturbed children who have inclinations to kill their classmates. I think you can address that and spend time, money, and resources addressing that issue while simultaneously leaving people's guns alone, because if you change that person's desire to want to kill their classmates, then whether the gun's there or not, they're not going to kill their classmates. If you don't change their desire to kill their classmates and you take the gun away, chances are they can do something else. They can use a vehicle, they can use a bomb, they can use a knife. There's lots of things that they can do. So I think it's better to address the root of the problem, in this case domestic violence, than it is to just say, okay, let's remove guns first and then worry about domestic violence second. I think it can be the opposite, and I think in the long run will have a much better effect, but what do I know? That's just my opinion. Okay, establish a new task force for online harassment and abuse to focus on connection between mass shootings, online harassment, extremism, and violence against women. Let's read what this says. As president, Joe Biden will convene a national task force with federal agencies, state leaders, advocates, law enforcement, and technology experts to study rampant online sexual harassment, stalking, and threats, including revenge porn and deepfakes, and the connection between this harassment, mass shootings, extremism, and violence against women. The task force will be charged with developing cutting-edge strategies and recommendations for how federal and state government, social media companies, schools, and other public and private entities can tackle this unique challenge. The task force will consider platforms' accountability, transparent reporting requirements for incidents of harassment and response, and best practices. This is an awful idea. This is basically nanny state government coming in with a task force to monitor the internet, exchanges between people and things that happen. Of course, if there are things, I'm fairly certain that revenge porn and things like that are illegal. So if there are things like that that happen, of course, they should be investigated. If there are children online, what we need is parents to come forward and parents to monitor their children's use online. If you're going to allow your 14, 15, 16-year-old to have access to the internet and access to social media network sites where these sorts of things happen, parents need to be the ones to be monitoring their exposure and their use on these websites, not the government. What's going to happen is you have things like extremism and violence against women. What does that mean? People have been accused of violence against women because, like, female comedians were called not funny. I remember, what's her name? The the one that always does the vulgar comedy. Gosh, I can't believe I'm spacing her name right now. But anyway, you guys probably know who I'm talking about. She had like a web series that came out, and then it was overwhelmingly, it was on Netflix, and it was overwhelmingly hated. And, you know, they came out and CNN came out and was like, look at all these Trump-supporting right-wing extremists, anti-feminist guys who hate women and they don't want to see her succeed and blah, 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 just because they didn't like her stupid jokes on her special. And that, you know, Netflix had to remove their rating system because of it. And is that called harassment? Is that hate against women? And that's the problem you run into. What will be the outcome? Will this then give platforms like Facebook and YouTube the carte blanche that they want to be able to remove dissent, because now they're in violation of this this new task force of online harassment? Okay, moving on. Make sure firearm owners take on the responsibility of ensuring their weapons are used safely. Put America on the path to ensure that 100% of firearms sold in America are smart guns. Oh boy, here we go. Today we have the technology to allow only authorized users to fire a gun. For example, existing smart gun technology requires a fingerprint match before use. Biden believes we should work to eventually require that 100% of firearms sold in the U.S. are smart guns. But right now, the NRA and gun manufacturers are bullying firearms dealers who try to sell these guns. Biden will stand up against these bullying tactics and issue a call to action for gun manufacturers, dealers, and other public and private entities to take steps to accelerate our transition to smart guns. Okay, a bunch to unpack here. I have not heard of a single solitary gun retailer, and if you are one of these gun retailers, please feel free to correct me on this, who has been chomping at the bit to replace all of their inventory with smart gun technology firearms, or for that matter, just to stock a variety of smart gun technology firearms. The firearm community as a whole, and I'm not speaking to anybody, I'm not speaking for everybody, but the firearm community as a whole is pretty much opposed to technology like this. There are so many issues involved in smart gun technology, and I'll just name a few. Number one, if you're going to require that all firearms have smart gun technology, the cost of firearm manufacturing and production is going to be huge. Companies like Glock and Smith & Wesson are going to have to implement a whole bunch of R&D to get that technology on board with their current products. They're going to have to change machines and molds to, like, every Glock 19 that comes out now has to have the sensors added into them. They're going to have to change the design and layout of the product in order to get those gadgets and that technology into the firearm. The problem is mechanical devices, especially electrical devices, are absolutely known for failing. We are not yet in the age where all digital devices are 100% accurate and effective. In fact, we're far from that. Mechanical devices over time will require replacement parts and things like that, and oftentimes somebody might not know that their product is defective until, you know, they need to use it to defend themselves or their lives. There's also the loss. I mean, if you're going to have to carry around a bracelet or anything like that to use with the firearm, if we're talking about keeping kids from being able to use them to, you know, go shoot up their school or something like that, you know, God forbid, you know, all they need to do is steal the bracelet with the gun that they're already stealing. So I don't know what that does. For police departments, if they want police officers to have that technology, that's up to the departments that are using them. If I were a police officer, I would not feel comfortable engaging with potentially violent people on a daily basis, knowing that there is a mechanical link between my ability to save or protect my life or another person and, you know, not. So I think this is the whole statement. The NRA and the gun manufacturing companies are bullying people out of this. That's just so ridiculous. This has no chance in passing. This would be fought on every level, and I can't even believe that this would have partisan support from the Democrats in its entirety for technology like this. The next question is, what happens with pre-existing firearms? Do they have to be retrofitted with this technology? If I have a German Luger, do I have to go destroy its value and get some sort of chip implanted into the frame to be able to use it? If not, and there's like a cutoff date, what will basically happen is nobody will buy these guns, and then the market for used firearms will explode. Imports will explode, you know, guns that can come in that don't need this ridiculous technology. And it will kill Glock and Smith and all of them, all of their ability to sell new product, because people would just go out and buy the old ones if they don't require that they have the technology instilled in them. So Biden supports legislation holding adults criminally and civilly liable for directly or negligently giving a minor access to a firearm, regardless of whether the minor actually gains possession of the firearm. This basically, there's a little bit of murky water here. What if you are with the child on the gun range, you've given them access to the firearm, and they accidentally shoot somebody on the range, with themselves or you? Are you, the parent, held responsible for that? I believe the main purpose of this is like, if you don't have a gun safe at home and you just leave your handgun in your nightstand and your kid gets access to it and shoots himself or his little brother, you, the parent, there's some truth to that. I believe that there are child endangerment laws that come into play here. If you're going to keep a loaded firearm in the house, I mean, for the love of God, I mean, even just for keeping the name of the gun community better and for the protection of your family and loved ones, keep it safe. If you're not next to it, keep it in a little safe. It's not that difficult to do. There's really no reason a 4-year-old should get their hands on a firearm that's fully loaded and ready to rock and roll. I know that a lot of anti-gun people like to paint this picture that every single gun owner is walking around with a loaded gun, just totally out in the middle of the living room coffee table. It's a very small minority of people who actually leave loaded guns out and accessible for children or people to get them who shouldn't have access to them. Very small number. And I don't know if I disagree with the fact that if you're going to be that negligent, if your kid can get access to a gun like that, I believe, and it leads to their death or the death of a neighbor, friend, or something like that. I keep my firearm secure. If at night my nightstand gun, it stays in a lockbox. At night I unlock it so I have quick access to it. In the morning I lock it, the key goes with me. If my son went to a neighbor's house and the guy just left a loaded handgun out on the kitchen table and another neighborhood kid picked it up and shot my son with it, yeah, I would want that parent to be held responsible for leaving their gun out where a 6-year-old can get it and shoot my kid with it. So sorry if you disagree with me, but I think that there's really no excuse for that. And if you don't have kids, one day when you do have kids, you'll understand. Require gun owners to safely store their weapons. Now, with that being said, I don't want this to be used as backdoor legislation. We have to have very clear-cut definitions of what safe storage is. If they're going to say that a gun in a locked safe next to your nightstand is not safe storage, and I disagree with that. But as long as non-safe storage basically says if your gun is loaded with a round in the chamber, the safety off, just out in plain reach and sight of anybody who walks by, then yeah, that's clear and cut non-safe storage of a firearm. Require gun owners to safely store their weapons. Biden will pass legislation requiring firearms owners to store their weapons safely at home. That's basically what we just talked about. Empower law enforcement to effectively enforce our gun laws. Prioritize prosecution of straw purchases. So a straw purchase, of course, is when somebody buys a firearm on behalf of another person who cannot pass the background check themselves. Biden will end these loopholes by enacting a law. First of all, that's not a loophole. That is somebody circumventing and breaking the law. A loophole is a legal means by which these things can be completed. There is no legal straw purchase. A straw purchase is a straw purchase, and a straw purchase is illegal. Biden will end these loopholes by enacting a law to make all straw purchases a serious federal crime. It already is. It says on the form right at the top, if you lie on this form in saying that you're the buyer when you are in fact not, if you lie in the form, you can face 10 years in prison and a $250,000 fine. So straw purchases are not this thing that we just allow to happen. They do happen. What happens is when people are typically caught in the commission of a straw purchase after the fact, like somebody sells it or somebody buys a gun on behalf of somebody else, that person then uses it in a crime, and then they trace the firearm and found that the purchaser was a different person. They then investigate, find a straw purchase had been conducted, and that person is criminally charged. That actually happened recently in a case here in Indiana where that exact thing happened. The person who was prohibited got the gun, shot a police officer, I believe in the eye. He survived, thank God, but can no longer work. And that police officer sued the gun store. And of course, the person who did the purchase, the shooter, was killed by the police officer, but the person who committed the straw purchase, who purchased the firearm for his friend, who then used it to shoot a police officer in the eye, he was criminally charged and I think is facing 10 or 15 years in prison. So I don't understand there. I guess, yeah, if you want to come down harder on straw purchasers, but it's already a very illegal thing to do. Notify law enforcement when a potential firearm purchaser fails the background check. So right now, and I can read this, it says, too often when prohibited persons attempting to buy a firearm fail the background check, the state and local law enforcement is never informed of this attempt. As President As president, Biden will direct the FBI to set up a process to ensure timely notification of denials to state and local law enforcement, and he'll support legislation to codify this process. This empowers law enforcement to follow up and to ensure prohibited persons do not attempt to acquire firearms through other means. Of course, if you fail a background check, it's true. I mean, I've had people fail background checks, and I know that like police or nothing followed up on that. I mean, sometimes people do get denied for incorrect reasons. That I've had that happen because people get appeals letters. I don't know to speak too much to that, but basically, yeah, if they want to put more emphasis on going after people who have failed a background check, I guess that doesn't really affect most people any way or the other unless you fail background checks. Require firearms owners to report if their firearm is lost or stolen. So currently, you do not have to legally report the loss or theft of your firearm. They want to make that law. I don't disagree with it. I mean, I guess it's up to you if you want. I mean, I don't know why you would not want to report it stolen. Of course, you don't want that to come back to you through a trace. Plus, you want the police to actively start looking for your expensive, firearm that's been stolen from you, and you want to get it back. So most people I know would report it stolen. Why you would not want to report it stolen, I don't know, but they want to make it a legal requirement to report it stolen. I don't see a big issue there. I don't think it would really affect anybody. Stop ghost guns. One way people who cannot legally obtain a gun may gain access to a weapon is by assembling one on their own, either by buying a kit or disassembling gun parts. Kit or disassembled gun parts, or 3D printing a working firearm. Biden will work to stop the proliferation of these so-called ghost guns by passing legislation that requires that purchases of gun kits or 3D printing code pass a federal background check. Additionally, Biden will ensure that the authority for firearms experts stays with the State Department and is needed to reverse proposed rule by Donald Trump. This will ensure that the State Department continues to block the code used to 3D print firearms from being made available to the internet. A couple things there. Let's talk about parts kits. First of all, you can legally purchase parts kits, which basically contain all the firearms parts other than the receiver. The firearm parts kit is useless without the receiver. You can't do anything with it. The receiver is what houses all the fire control groups, the bolts, depending on what the gun is. You can legally purchase a receiver or frame and build that parts kit into a working firearm. The most common way we see this done is with AR-15s. In order to get an AR-15 receiver that is considered legally a firearm, you have to already go through a background check to get that. There is no circumventing that. Okay. Now, one thing that you can do, and he didn't really explain this, is you can get an 80% lower, which is just a piece of aluminum, and it's only 80% complete, because that is 80 to 81% is when the law considers it a block of aluminum. At 81% complete, it's considered a firearm. So you buy it at 80% complete. You can buy that without the completion of a background check. You can have that 80% sent right to your house, but you will need the tools, equipment, machines, and know-how in order to turn that into a firearm receiver. Of course, it will not be serialized. Now, once you have that, yes, you can build a firearm into it, according, depending on what state you're in, but you cannot make those for the purpose of selling to other people. So if you're going to make one, you have to make it for yourself. It's basically how that rule goes. That's what a lot of people call ghost guns. There's been a lot of lawsuits with people, I think in California, mainly on the West Coast, for people who are building frames and receivers and have machine shops where they allow private people to do that in their place of business. So they want to stop that and basically have everything done as completed, lower, serialized, and go through FFL background checks. I don't agree with it, but that's just another controversial topic for debate. And I know a lot of pro-gun people who are against the 80% or so thing. It's just kind of like the FUD lore there. The next thing is the 3D printing. Okay, there's been a lot of back and forth. There is an individual who had 3D printing programs, or basically files that had the plans for a firearm, functioning firearm that could be printed at home if you have a 3D printer to do that. The Obama era Justice Department tried to put a stop to it. It was reversed, so now he has the legal right to, because he's just distributing plans on the firearm. He's not actually selling firearms. So it would be up to the person who has a 3D printer to actually go through the process of printing the firearm. If we are allowing people to make at-home guns, and you can legally, you can build like a pipe shotgun and things like that. I don't know why you can't build a 3D printed firearm. honestly, if people are afraid of people getting firearms that they can use in the commission of a crime or get easily, I mean, guys, it's going to be way more hard to go out, buy the equipment and the material and the program and know what you're doing. And then when the thing's printed, I mean, these things are like 1 or 2 shots before they're destroyed anyway. I know technology is getting better. They're trying to get to the head of this before it gets, the ability of these programs become better. But to me, it's kind of a non-issue. It'll be so much easier for somebody to go out into a back alley and buy a stolen gun than to go through the headache of purchasing a 3D printer and making a gun at home. And it's like if they're afraid that people are going to mass produce these and sell these in back alleys, it's like they're the cheapest, crappiest things. If there's going to be criminals running around with 3D printed guns, I'd much rather them have that than stolen Glocks and things like that. Because again, these things are pretty, I mean, it's like they survive 2 or 3 rounds and then they're done. So anyway, there's that for you. Direct the ATF to issue an annual report on firearms trafficking. This report will provide officials with critical information to better identify strategies for curbing firearm trafficking. Okay, so one of the things that we do as a gun store is we have a multiple disposition form, and the multiple disposition form is if anybody purchases 2 or more handguns in a 5 business day period, we have to notify the ATF and local law enforcement that that's happened. That was in place because of firearm trafficking, so that's one thing that we're doing. So if they want to firearm trafficking, if they want to go after that, of course, doesn't really affect legal gun owners, don't have a problem with it, whatever they want to do. Okay, moving on to the next heading, tackle urban gun violence with targeted evidence-based community intervention. So daily acts of gun violence in our communities may not be making national headlines, and that's right, they don't, but are just as devastating to survivors and victims' families as gun violence that does make the front pages. And these daily acts of gun violence disproportionately impact communities of color. But there is reason to be optimistic. There are proven strategies for reducing gun violence in urban communities without turning to incarceration. For example, group violence intervention organizes community leaders to work with individuals most likely to commit acts of gun violence. Expressive communities demand that gun violence stop and connect individuals who may be likely perpetrators with social and economic support services that may deter violent behaviors. These types of interventions have reduced homicides as much as 60%. Hospital-based violence intervention engages young people who have been injured by gun violence while they are still in the hospital, connecting them to social and economic services that may decrease the likelihood they engage in or are victims of gun violence in the future. Biden will create a $900 million 8-year incentive to fund these and other types of evidence-based interventions in 40 cities across the country, 20 cities in the highest number of homicides. Okay, so one thing here, and I actually do really like this, is we are finally addressing that a big part of the gun violence issue in this country is urban-based gang-related violence. Finally, somebody's saying it. So I do appreciate the fact that this is in here, and I do think that it's good to have intervention practices in place. We're not focusing on the gun in this perspective. We're focusing on the community. And if we can get funding in these communities, increase outreach programs, services for people to get them away from gang-related activity and things like that, I think the communities will have a overall better outcome. And yes, it will serve to reduce gun violence in these inner cities, which will bring down the national rates of gun-related homicide, wholesale. I do like the fact that at least, I mean, it's kind of, we're getting towards the end here of the policy, so it's tucked away here at the bottom. Again, I do like the fact that we are focusing on a fundamental root cause of gun violence. It's impoverished cities, gang-related activity, instead of just saying, let's ban guns, let's ban guns, let's ban guns. Because again, you get rid of guns, you don't get rid of the economic problem in these areas, you don't get rid of gang-related problems in these areas. And once you ban guns, these same gangs are not going to give up their firearms, and they will have a whole new great line of business to engage in, just like they did during Prohibition. So I'm totally on board with that. I do like the idea of focusing on making neighborhoods safer, getting rid of gangs, going after criminals, things like that, in order to quell gun violence in these areas. Great idea, I'm on board with it. Dedicate the brightest scientific minds to solving the gun violence public health epidemic. In 2013, President Obama issued a memorandum clarifying that a longstanding appropriations rider that prohibited the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, and other federal scientific agencies from using federal dollars to advocate to promote gun control. does not prohibit those agencies from researching the causes and preventions of gun violence. The National Institute of Health, NIH, subsequently embarked on funding some of this research through Republican leadership in Congress refused to appropriate any funds to the CDC. The problem is a lot of these organizations are very partisan, and they can be very selective of the data that they are creating and putting out there. And that's a reason a lot of people, I mean, if we're going to say let's fund research on gun control, it's just like, to Democrats, it would be just as appalling as saying, let's enlist the NRA to do the research. Okay, of course, it's going to be a very biased research piece, and that's exactly how Republicans view the CDC. Whether you think that there is cause for that or not, or whether you think that's justifiable apprehension or not, that's typically the reason cited. Is we are not really getting, and the CDC, they did research on the assault weapons ban that was not actually very convincing, and I think that was a huge reason to leading why Republicans wanted to defund research or not have researching done through the CDC, because again, you're coming up with a bunch of data that we're going to use to springboard political action and laws, and that data is very partisan and very biased, so that's why. I think some people have proposed and have been on board with the idea of coming up with a coalition that is voted on by Congress, the people who will be conducting the research, and you have to have a stated, 3 Republican, 3 Democrat, and have them come together with their findings. But it really, in this political day and age and the political nature of gun ownership, and gun ownership is kind of like the proverbial football in the political landscape. It's always been kicked back and forth. You have to just have a cut and clear, okay, we have 3 from the left, 3 from the right, this is what they're going to do, and come up with ideas. Okay, moving on. Prohibit the use of federal funds to arm or train educators to discharge firearms. That's such a funny statement. I'm going to read that again. Prohibit the use of federal funds to arm or train educators to discharge firearms. Educators to use firearms safely, to carry firearms safely. I think that it's very disingenuous to say that we're going to try and reduce the risk of gun-related violence if we're not going to try multiple things. Some things to try that we have not tried is if there are certain educators that want to carry, they elect to carry. Now, if you're a teacher who doesn't want to carry a gun, then that's totally fine. But if you are one who wants to carry a gun and you want to get training on it, and training could include safe storage in the classroom. You could have issued lock boxes where it needs to be, where if an announcement of a intruder comes up over the loudspeaker, the teacher can get to it, but otherwise it's locked in that box for eternity until that happens. I think the fear becomes we don't want guns to come into the school, because then like the armed teacher can go crazy and shoot people. If the teacher's going to go crazy and want to shoot people, the teacher's going to bring their gun to school. I don't understand how that stops it. And it's not like just because the gun's there, they're just going to snap and start wanting to shoot people. I guess the other argument goes for kids getting a hold of it. Again, if you have a protocol for a locked box where the gun stays unless there's necessity to remove it, then that will reduce the risk of that happening. The other thing is, and most importantly, is if we talk about other methods of protecting kids in schools, and what we're ultimately doing is taking the topic away from banning guns, which is what they want. So that's the real reason we don't want to do this, or they don't want to do this, is because if we talk about arming teachers, then we're not talking about banning guns, and that's really it. It's a very disingenuous argument, so I hate it. Address the epidemic of suicides by firearms. Biden believes any plan to address the gun violence epidemic must address suicides by firearms, which account for 6 in 10 gun-related deaths, but are often left out of the conversation. They're left out of the conversation drastically by people on the left. Okay, if you wanted to make it part of the conversation, don't say 30,000 people kill themselves every year with guns. Say 30,000 people are killed every year with guns. Say 10,000 people are killed in homicides and 20,000 people are killed in suicides by firearms every year. But it's so much more convenient to just put that big number out there, because then it looks like people are just getting mown down in the streets, which just isn't really the case. Many of the policies noted above, including safe storage requirements and extreme risk protection orders, will have a serious impact on efforts. So the thing about suicide is, if somebody is depressed enough, they're going to find a way to commit suicide. True, there have been people who have been found who have tried to hang themselves, who have taken pills, and they have been saved and then reformed and then go on to lead normal lives. A firearm is very, like, once you pull that trigger, there's no really saving you in most cases. But the very access, just the ability for people to get firearms, does not lead to an increase in suicide likeliness. Japan, for example, has a huge suicide issue, and Japan also has very strict gun control laws, so people still routinely find ways to kill themselves, whether they have access to firearms or not. Again, I think it's always great to try and address public health, reduce the desire for people to want to kill themselves rather than just remove the gun, because just removing the gun isn't going to remove the desire for them to kill themselves. They're still going to try and kill themselves. So again, this is something that can, again, we should talk about it. I think it's great that it's in here, but saying that, and I don't think that they're saying that guns lead to suicide, but they're making the implication that if we got rid of guns, suicides would decrease. If they did, it would be by a small margin, in my opinion. But there's so much more we need to do to support people experiencing suicidal ideation. I agree. In the months ahead, Biden will put forward a comprehensive plan to improve access to mental health services. I think that's great. I think getting people mental health screenings and checks and things like that, getting access to those sorts of services, will work wonders in reducing suicide, homicide, mass shootings, things like that, way more than removing guns will. So I do appreciate that approach, and I hope that it proves to help people in the way that it should. Supporting survivors of violence and their communities. Violence causes ripples of trauma throughout our communities, impacting not just the victim of violence, but also their communities and first responders. Fear of school shootings is having a notable impact on the mental health of Gen Z. That's because it's plastered everywhere on the news. The sensationalization, the people's, to be caught up in a mass shooting, your chances of being struck by lightning 3 times in your life are greater. I'm not saying that to diminish or to minimize the lives of those people who have been lost in these events, and they do happen. But the sensationalization is terrifying people thinking that's going to happen, and also the sensationalization, and this has been seen in many of these shooters' manifestos as they get fame. I think if you approach the news media coverage on these sorts of things, you would see a drastic drop in people's fear of shootings and the actual outcome or perpetrations of shootings. I would like to see that addressed. Now, I am not in favor of restricting freedom of speech and the free press, not at all. But I mean, I wish that these news organizations would take it upon themselves to just chill out when it comes to these sorts of things, and it will really lead to a lower likelihood that these sorts of things will happen, and people stress about them happening as well. Intimate partner violence is linked to depression, post-traumatic stress, and other mental challenges among survivors. So saying survivors of these events will typically lead to a higher risk of being abusive or such down the road. Again, I don't know if that's the gun problem, the gun's fault, but and this trauma can be intergenerational. Science now shows that young children who witness violence, including in their home, literally alters the parts of their brains that affect reasoning, planning, and behavioral control. I talked about that already. I believe that that's true. If you are a child brought up in a home with abuse, you are likely to perpetuate that abuse when you are an adult. Okay, I think the data suggests that. We need to reduce violence to prevent trauma from happening in the first place, but we also must treat the resulting trauma as serious. So again, I don't know what that has to do with guns, trying to tie in domestic violence and gun ownership, I guess, but yeah, I agree. Have support for people who are going through these sorts of things. I definitely agree with that. And then at the bottom here of his plan is to make federal programs more trauma-informed, create a network for trauma care centers, and train healthcare and other service providers in trauma centers. So again, not really gun-related in my opinion, but increasing funding for things that they're trying to tie into the root cause as being gun ownership. So that's basically it on his policies. Anyway, guys, that is my overview of the Biden plan to end our gun violence epidemic as listed on their website. Hopefully you enjoyed that. If you did, please let me know by hitting that like button. If you want to see more videos like this, please consider subscribing to this channel and also my main channel, Marksman TV. If you have any questions or comments, please leave those down below. Anyway, guys, I'm going to leave you off there. I am Chris. You are watching Marksman Radio. We will see you next time.